The research paper I've chosen is titled Performance Analysis of Queries in Rdbms versus NoSQL, presented at the 2019 Second International Conference on Intelligent Computing, Instrumentation, and Control Technologies. Due to enormous amount of data being generated and stored nowadays, we need to understand how to choose the right database for optimizing our performance and to avoid the loss of information. So this paper is based on a comparative study between MySQL versus MongoDB, that is relational and non-relational databases. Data analytics and management is crucial in every business, be it e-commerce, banking, and medical applications. Thus, we need to analyze the performance of different databases available to pick the appropriate option that is best suited for data manipulation and retrieval. So, in order to choose, factors like query execution and performance, scalability, and cost of the database are taken into consideration. So the contents include we are going to understand what is the difference between the relational and non-relational database. Then, for a particular example, like MySQL versus MongoDB, what are the differences? How the data is being stored? What is the terminology? In the literature survey for the paper, the result and the analysis. So the verification of a comparative study is then using hypothesis testing. So we are going to see the result and analysis and then the conclusion. So first, let us understand what are relational and non-relational databases. So relational databases store data in the form of tables, and two tables can have some shared information, which may indicate that there is some relationship between the two tables. So a column in a table is known as a particular attribute, and a row is known as a tuple, which is basically an individual record in the database. Okay. So some of the features of relational databases are it has a predefined schema. So whatever schema we have to define, we define it beforehand. We cannot change this once we start inserting data into the database. Then it is good for complex queries. It is vertically scalable and it has a specific language. So mostly all relational databases follow structured query language. Now, non-relational databases, also known as NoSQL databases, is a kind of database which doesn't use tables, fields, and columns. They have been designed with the cloud in mind, so making them great at horizontal scaling. So there are different types of non-relational databases like document databases, key value database, wide column database, and graph database. So a document database stores information in some JSON-like format. So that is in key value pairs. Then graph databases, they use the structure called as nodes and store data, and the edges contain attributes to the relationship. So that is how we make use of a graph or the data structure graph for implementing it in a database. Then, non-relational databases are not a good fit for complex queries. There is no specific language as such because there is no specific schema, no structure, and they are horizontally scalable. So MySQL and MongoDB. MySQL is a popular open source RDBMS supported by Oracle, and MongoDB is an open source database which stores in data in JSON-like documents. So in MySQL, individual records are called rows, and in MongoDB, individual records are called as documents. A table is used to store records of the similar type, and documents belonging to a particular class or group are stored in a collection. And MySQL follows structured query language for database access, and the schema cannot be changed. And MongoDB is a NoSQL database. It has a dynamic schema. We don't have to adhere to a particular or a predefined structure, and we can change the documents and the collection and can different structures also. These are some terminologies which are equivalent. So in MySQL table, so MongoDB collection, a row that is an individual record is nothing but a document in MongoDB, and column which represent attributes in MySQL, it is known as the field in MongoDB. And we can also see the data representation. A document, this is storing the values are being stored in name key value pairs and in the JavaScript object notation. And a record in MySQL, we can see that it is just a tabular record. Structure of the paper. So for the purpose of illustration, we are taking the example of storing a record of company employee details. To foreground the advantages and benefits of non-relational database MongoDB, it is compared with the relational database Oracle. Basic four operations are going to be discussed or going to be analyzed and were performed on both the databases like insert, delete, select, and update. And both the databases, first initially 10 records were inserted, and then we increased the record size to 100,000 and 10,000. And all the study was conducted in a controlled environment. So the system specification was Windows 10 64-bit OS and Intel Core i5 and 4 GB RAM. So literature survey, The analysis construes the time taken by the two databases for these different operations like join, insertion, retrieval. And the claim is that MySQL performs better for simple queries while with smaller data sets, and MongoDB works better efficient for complex queries with large data sets. And they have performed the analysis for insertion and search operation for up to 25,000 records. And they claim that the relational databases suffer from horizontal scaling, whereas NoSQL performs better than MySQL. They claim the data is large. When the data is large, the load balancing will become difficult for SQL, whereas MongoDB has a inbuilt load balancer which will take care of the load balancing. And also a comparative study of MySQL and MongoDB is performed, which claim that works better, or it is a better alternative than MySQL. So resultant analysis. So we can see here the execution time in milliseconds for MySQL and MongoDB. So for 10, 100,000 and 10,000 records, the main objective was to compare and analyze the execution time, the query performance. So for each operation, we have performed hypothesis testing, and so a particular type of test used, which is known as the ANOVA test, is used. So ANOVA also stands for analysis of variance, is a statistical technique which is used for checking that if the means of two different data groups are significantly different from each other or not. So ANOVA will check the impact of one or more factors by comparing means of different samples. We have two different sample populations, and we are going to compare the mean, and we are going to see how much are they different from each other, and depending on that, we are going to find out what is the difference between the two sample populations and perform a comparative analysis. So yeah, in hypothesis testing, we have the null hypothesis H0, and then we also have defined the alternative hypothesis. So we calculate the mean sum of squares between the sample and sum of square within the sample, then the degrees of freedom, and then the mean of squares between the sample and within the sample. And based on that, we know that the F ratio or the F score for the ANOVA test is MS, that is mean of squares between upon mean square within, and this ratio we take into account, and so you can see that the value is 0.65. So there is also a F distribution table, and if you verify or we cross check from the distribution table for degree of freedom 1 and 6, the value is 5.99. So whenever F calculated is less than F tabulated, we can see that we reject the alternative hypothesis and accept the null hypothesis. So just like we have done this for insertion operation, we have done the same testing for deletion, selecting, and for updating. And finally, these are the charts for comparison for different number of records in the timing. So yeah. So if you see carefully from the graphs, except for updation or for insert, delete, and select, we can see that MongoDB is performing better than Oracle or MySQL, but only for the updation operation, we can see that MongoDB is taking a relatively more greater time than Oracle. If you see for 10,000 records, insertion, updation of 10,000 records in my database. So we can conclude that uh, MongoDB is a better option for insert, delete, and search select operation. Whereas for updation operation, MySQL is a better option, and it performs better in the given environment. So the result can vary depending on the system specification, depending on the environment, depending on the type of data being inserted, it will depend upon the amount or the size, volume of the data which is being inserted or being basically manipulated in the database. And yeah, so this is the bibliography. Thank you.